Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the second half of this presentation. If you haven't watched part one, then some of this won't make too much sense, but hopefully you enjoyed getting a little snapshot into Plato's view of reality. Now remember, for Plato, he was trying to create some sort of connection between the material world and the immaterial world. The material world, which is this physical world that we exist in, that our bodies exist in at least, is ever changing. Think of, yourself growing, your hair grows, you cut it. Nothing in the physical world lasts or is permanent. Everything will eventually change or die out. And then there is the eternal immaterial world, which Plato referred to as the world of the forms, or the world of being. Now this, he argued, is the true reality. And the key difference here is that in the world of forms, we have essentially perfect ideas or perfect concepts of things. So what we mean by that is, and to use the example that was in the PowerPoint, the idea of a horse. How do you know the idea of a horse when the only way that you can describe a horse is by using physical descriptions, and that matches with lots of other animals? With Plato, what Plato argued was that the reason that you know the difference between a horse and a dog, even though they share similar physical qualities, is that your mind has access to this perfect world, and within that world you have kind of knowledge of horseness, if that makes sense. Aristotle is Plato's sort of star student, and funnily enough, even though Aristotle certainly idealized Plato, they disagreed on a whole lot of things. So we're going to see a very different view of the nature of reality, of metaphysics, from Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that there is only one world. We don't need a second world of forms to be able to explain the existence that we have. For Aristotle, let's just focus on the physical world, and we don't need to create some other world. So, how does Aristotle do this? How does he solve the problem of how we know things that are non-physical? Well, let's see. Before we do get started, though, a bit of background on Aristotle. So, much like Plato, actually, Aristotle was definitely a golden child of ancient Greece. His father was extraordinarily influential, and he was a very, very, very sought-after doctor. And Aristotle, was going to be following in his father's footsteps. But like any good Greek boy, he gets sent off to school to get a good education first, and his father actually sends him to the school that Plato created, which was Plato's Academy. And so this is where Aristotle and Plato meet. Aristotle ends up spending a really, really, really long time at the Academy, and kind of becoming the scientist slash philosopher slash everything that he ends up being. So he lived between 384 and 322 BC, and after he leaves the Academy, he actually ends up creating his own school, which was called the Lyceum. And within that school, he taught Plato's works. So even though he disagreed with a lot of what Plato said, he still taught the works and taught his students to think about them and criticize them, and I'm sure that he definitely would have expressed his disagreement, we might say, with what Plato has said. So he was, like many of the great philosophers, really one of the world's great thinkers. And what he really was the world's first scientist. So things like the periodic table that you would have learnt about in chemistry, Aristotle was the first guy to actually have a run at that, and try and figure out the basic building blocks that our entire universe is made of. If you've studied biology, you would know that we break up living organisms into different categories. For example, with animals, we have mammals and fish and reptiles and birds. Well, Aristotle was the first person to start to categorize animals like that. So you can see that his legacy is definitely still living on today. And in his works, he talked about everything. He writes more like a scientist than a philosopher, which makes a lot of sense. and so his works deal with the nature of the universe and physical existence, but also on how to be a good person and what he thought the right way to bring up children in society was. So he did write on a lot of different topics. But what did he think about metaphysics? Well, as the first dot point there says, Aristotle definitely disagreed with Plato's view of the forms. He thought that Plato was just making things unnecessarily complicated by adding a second world, essentially, into his philosophy. For Aristotle, you don't need a second world to explain the nature of reality. This physical world provides enough explanation. So he disagreed with the existence of the world of being. And he did not agree with Plato that there were things like perfect forms of things, and that's where we got our understanding from. So the next question that we need to ask is, well, then according to Aristotle, where does our understanding come from? As we pointed out, there's a problem where every time we try and describe what a horse is, it also fits with a dog or a giraffe or whatever. How do we then know what a horse is? Well, Aristotle takes a much more practical approach, and he just says, well, as you grow up, when you see animals, your parents or whoever say, well, that's a horse. And then you see something that looks a little bit different because it's maybe a different breed of horse. And you ask what animal it is, and whoever you're talking to says, well, that's a horse too. And slowly what starts to happen in your life is you start to build up a basic understanding of what it takes to be a horse. And remember, this is just one example. This goes for absolutely everything. Aristotle just argued that through your experience of the world, you slowly build up an understanding of these different ideas and these different concepts. Our mind doesn't need to access some, mystical, immaterial world to be able to understand what a horse is. It's just that as you grow up, you experience lots of different horses, you understand them all to be horses, and so as it's got there, you develop an understanding of what horseness, if I can coin the term, of what horseness is. There's no such thing as a perfect idea of a horse. Now, even though Aristotle is a materialist, so he does argue that there is only the material world, he did say that we can divide the physical world into two things, though. So there's primary beings and then secondary qualities. And a good way to think about this is that a primary being is kind of the thing itself, and then secondary qualities are what that thing is composed of. So the example I've got on the PowerPoint there, a good example of a primary being is a tree. Now, what is a tree made of? Well, it's made up of a trunk and a series of branches and leaves and roots. And so all of these things themselves are secondary qualities. We can apply this to lots of different things. The book in front of you, or the computer screen in front of you, that as a primary being, it's a book. But what are its secondary qualities? Well, it has a series of pages, it has certain colors, it has certain words. These are all secondary qualities. But what is its primary being? Well, it is that book, that specific book. Okay? He then argued that we need to separate substance and essence. Okay, so substances are things which stand alone. They are the core of what a single thing is, and they allow us to understand that thing even after its secondary qualities change. So as it says there, your substance is what keeps you even after you get a haircut. So if we go back to the idea of a tree, well, how do I recognize a tree as still being the same tree even when a branch is cut off it? Well, what I'm doing is I'm changing the secondary qualities of that tree, but the substance of that tree is still the same. I still understand it to be the same. How do you remain the same person? How do people still recognize you as you when you come back from getting a haircut, even though your hair has been, say, cut shorter? Well, because your secondary qualities have changed, and in this case we're talking about the length of your hair, but your primary qualities have not. Okay, and your substance, what is you, what makes you sort of stand alone, has not changed. Okay, but this is a little bit tricky, because if we think back to the definition, let's say trying to define a horse, and trying to come up with a description of a horse that doesn't include a dog. So I can't say things like, well, it's covered in fur. Well, so's a dog. It has 4 legs. So's a dog. It has a tail. So's a dog. It has a log face. So's a dog. Okay? I can't say that. So how do I know how do I know that specific horse? This is where essence comes in. Okay? And this is much more difficult to understand. It's it's not an immaterial thing. Like, it does exist within you, according to Aristotle, but it is not something that is necessarily changeable about yourself. So your essence is what makes you you. Okay? What makes that tree that tree? Well, it's its essence. If you think about it, let's take something like a phone. I could line up 10 identical iPhones, or 10 phones identical to the one that you have, and you'd probably very quickly be able to pick which one is yours. What is it that makes your phone your phone? Well, that's its essence, okay? And that is much more difficult to change. That's not going to change with something like a haircut. Now, what is this physical world made of? Well, Aristotle actually called it matter, which is still the word we use for things in our physical existence now. We call them matter. So, again, there's lots of things that we still have today that was coined by Aristotle. Matter is what gives substances their structure. So matter is what makes you an actual physical thing. There's a YouTube link there, so jump online, watch the YouTube video, and hopefully it'll help to explain things a little bit more clearly. Okay, hopefully the video helped, but if that still isn't clear, let's use an example. I want you to try and describe yourself in a way that makes it impossible for you to be confused with anyone else. How could you possibly do that? It's a very difficult thing to do, because if you say your name, well, there's a very good chance that other people have got the same name as you, even first, last name, even first, middle, and last name. If you say your height, well, lots of people will be the same height. Your hair length, lots of people will have the same hair length. Eye color, physical features. It's very hard to describe you in a way that makes it impossible for you to be anyone else. Now, Aristotle pointed out that the fact that you exist as something which stands alone means that you have substance, which makes you a primary being. So you are a thing that stands alone. You're not something that makes up something else. So, for example, your fingers are not something that's standalone. Okay, they are part of what makes up you physically. But you stand alone. You don't make up anything else. The fact that you are your height and weight, that your hair is the color that it is, and that you have 10 fingers and toes are all examples of secondary qualities. Okay, so none of these things stand alone. All of these things could change, and you would still be the person that you are. But then what is it that makes you you? What is it that makes you the unique individual that you are? And Aristotle would say, well, that is your essence. And it's an indescribable thing. That doesn't mean that we need to create some immaterial world of the forms to explain it. But it's that thing that separates you from everyone else. We might call it your personality. We might call it your mind, whatever we want to call it. Aristotle called it your essence. Your essence is what makes you you, even when you change your hair color, or get a haircut. Even if you were to lose all of your toes climbing Everest, you would still come back as you. Now, your essence can change, but this would mean that you have fundamentally changed as a person. And we do hear people say this from time to time, that that person has changed, that they're not the person they were anymore. Aristotle would say, well, that is because their essence has actually changed, and they are no longer the person they were before. They still stand alone now, but they have a different essence. Okay, hopefully that clears things up from Aristotle's perspective. So complete the right activity on page 98 of your books, and I will see you next year.